The dust hung heavy over Dust Creek that evening, turning the air to golden ash. Folks said the town forgot how to breathe when he rode in, boots caked in dirt, eyes cold with memory. He stopped at the saloon door, the same one the sheriff used to stand in, and whispered the words that made every man turn pale. "You owe me a bullet, Sheriff." Silence fell like a shroud. Somewhere, a wind chime rang. The sheriff was inside, waiting. And between them, 10 years of guilt, blood, and a promise carved into the heart of the frontier. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The sun fell like a blade behind the low ridges, slicing Dust Creek into two colors, gold for the living, ash for what they'd been trying to forget, and the town seemed to fold inward the moment the stranger crested the road. The cowboy rode in slow, not because the horse was tired, but because a man who carries a debt walks on minutes, not hours, and the dust rose in a dry column from his hoofs and howled like an accusation, drawing faces to windows and porches. A child with a battered hoop froze mid-toss, a woman with flour on her hands pressed her fingers to her lips, a butcher paused with his knife half raised, and the preacher stopped his slow step and traced a cross as if marking the hour by fear. They had whispered his name for years until it became a cautionary tale of losses you could not bury, and now the rumor had a gait and a coat and a hat that cast a shadow over the town like a season. Eli Ward called him in soft voices, a name someone said under breath as if saying it too loud might wake a dead thing. And when he slowed at the boards, his horse's flanks heaved and the town's breath hitched as if remembering a storm. Eli dismounted without flourish, his movements the precise economy of a man who has learned to save energy for what actually costs, and his boots met the planks as though testing whether the world still held to its promises or had rearranged itself in 10 years to forget what had happened at those very boards. He did not come for whiskey or comfort. He came with a quiet that felt like a verdict, the sort of silence that straps itself around a moment and squeezes until truth slips out. The saloon door creaked, the same old iron knot creak that had once been the backdrop to laughter and to the shot that turned a morning brittle, and the sound ricocheted through the room like a bell tolling for a sin. Inside, the saloon had folded conversation into cautious glances and lowered heads, and there at the far end by a window that caught the dying light sat Sheriff Famous Grady, a man whose badge had grown heavier with every year and whose sleep had turned thin and shallow from the weight of what he'd done. Grady was older, the white at his temples like ash in the embers of a fire he couldn't put out, and he sat as if the seat might remember him differently than his hands remembered his deed. His fingers lay near the curve of his holster, though he did not reach for it. Habit and sorrow had long since braided together in his palms, and when Eli stood in the threshold, the room seemed to fold itself taut around the single thing neither man could outrun. Eli's face carried the map of 10 winters, a narrowness at the jaw, a scar pale against sun-dark skin where a bullet had grazed and not ended him, eyes that had learned to measure other people's heartbeats for a living and which now held a patience like a coiled rope. He smelled of sage and iron in the long road, a stale sort of prayer in the metallic memory of old blood, and he moved not with haste but with the deliberate, moral geometry of a man coming home to settle an account, conversation thin like smoke from a snuffed candle. A piano player let his fingers fall and a glass stopped high on its way to a lip. Someone behind the bar whispered Eli's name, a sound that was both benediction and summons, and Eli's voice when it came was low enough that it did not need to carry. "You owe me a bullet, Sheriff," he said, and the sentence landed in the room like a stone thrown into 10 years of silence, making concentric waves that touched every face and made old men wince and young men aver their eyes. No one moved. Even the dog under the table lifted its head as if listening to the bones of the world groan. Amos rose as if some long-taught reflex had finally been allowed to act, his shoulders square though the years had hollowed him. And for a single breath the two men regarded one another not as enemy and lawman but as two tired souls caught on the same fault line. Outside, the sky closed its fingers on the sun and the first small, indifferent star peeled into night as if the earth were taking witness to what was coming. And the sheriff's spetch caught the last light and made a dull coin between them. A token, a ledger entry, the weight of a claim. And for everyone in Dust Creek that evening had become a hench. Whatever moved next would tilt the town into a new shape. and there was no pretense left of innocence. Inside the saloon, the sound of living tint until it was almost a texture you could touch. The piano's fingers stilled at a glass hung halfway to a mouth as if the room itself were listening for something older than gossip. And when Eli leaned on the scarred counter, the place folded a notch quieter, the air drawing in like a long before a confession. Men who had spent their lives measuring risk by grain and weather weight, and with the slow arithmetic of farmers and gamblers, a miner's jaw tightened, a rancher's hat brim dipped, and women who had buried sons and husbands smoothed aprons with hands that had learned to steady trembling by practice rather than miracle. A drunk muttered, throat scraping the words out, "The war that never ended," and the phrase landed like a coin, clinking into a jar that held a decade's worth of small accusations and longer, rotten debts. No one laughed because the joke would have been a lie and the lie too costly to tell. They all remembered the duel in fragments and shards, the sun like an accusation at dawn, shots that sounded like punctuation to a letter nobody wanted to finish, a body that hit the dirt and did not rise, the rumor of betrayal like a slow leak in a good life. Dusk Creek had made a habit of stories that kept people awake, and this one, which had once been told under breath and by candle, now wore a man's stride and a hat and a face familiar as an old wound. Eli's voice came low and dry, less a shout than a calibration of fate, and when he asked for water, the barkeep's hands trembled for a second before filling the glass. Water for a man who might have asked for blood, and in that small refusal the room read a code. He had come not for theater but for the precise work of accounting. He spoke little. His sentences were like pebbles thrown into a pond, making tight, circular ripples that met and lengthened until the whole surface was rearranged. People watched for the sign that would tell them whether this was vengeance or justice. Faces leaned forward, not to gawk but to witness the settlement of an old, dangerous letter. The bartender, who had once seen men forgive over spilled whiskey and worse, set the glass down with a steadiness that belied his pulse. He had known both men in ball, had shaken their hands and seen their way. Guilt and duty sat on their shoulders like ill-fitting coats. Children pressed to the doorway, eyes wide and luminous with the particular bravery of the young who believe in the absolute edges of stories, while older folks measured time in the slack of a jaw and the tightening at the corner of the eye. Eli's hands bore the map of the road and the signs of things that do not heal neatly, a pale line across his ribs where the world had tried to close him, hands that could both soothe a frightened horse and close a man's life with a movement so clean it might be mercy. He kept his stare level, not sullen but patient as a field waiting for rain, and when a woman in the corner, one who had lost a brother to the same incident, let out a breath that could have been a prayer or a curse, it sounded the same, a small, private reconciliation with a past that would not let her rest. Rumors unspooled in quiet threads. Who else had been there? What was said before a gun went off? Whether the sheriff had shot to protect or to erase something that threatened him. Eli listened as people spilled these half-truths, not to correct them but to let them surface like weeds so they could be seen and pulled. The saloon seemed to shrink around him, all its varnished wood and the ghosts of laughter and argument pressing inward, and every eye in Dust Creek kept returning to the far corner where Sheriff Famous Grady sat, his profile a book of small contraband regrets, because the reckoning that had been whispered about at kitchen tables and on porches for 10 long years had a face, and that face was sitting very still, watching, waiting, and for each person there the question had changed from will he come? To what will we owe when he does? Sheriff Famous Grady sat with his back to the pane as if the glass could hold the light he'd lost, the badge on his chest a dull coin catching the last slant of day and reminding him of every hour he'd traded for this town's safety and his own private penance. The room upstairs smelled of stale tobacco and old paper, the type of smell that collects in places where decisions are made and regrets are stored, and he watched the street without needing to see. His memory supplied the town in sharper detail than the twilight could. The clapboard that always shed a splinter in the same place, the hitching post with a notch like a tooth, the saloon awning with its fringe chewed by years of wind. He had learned early that sitting still could be louder than any shout, that stillness could draw other men's disturbances into sharper relief. And for 10 years his stillness had been a kind of prayer that never answered. His hands, calloused, veined, the knuckles a map of a life that had held more reins than promises, rested near his hip, the revolver in its holster unbuckled because some parts of punishment needed a choice, not an accident, and because he had envisioned 100 endings to this account, some of them braver than the man he had been and some of them pruder, and only once in a while did he allow himself to imagine a result that felt like mercy. The deputy's bootfalls were wrong in the way young feet always are on weathered stairs, too quick, too loud for the house of an old man. And when the young man burst into the room pale and wide-eyed and said, "He's here," the sound shifted from a sentence to an event. Grady did not turn immediately. He had spent 10 years teaching his face to betray nothing, to keep the ledger of his guilt hidden beneath an ordinary look so the town could carry on its days without being crushed under the weight of his private mathematics. "I know," he said at last, voice low as if the word had cost him something to conjure. And it was not surprise in his tone but recognition. A reckoning that had stalked his dreams now walked the boards outside, and he had been waiting, not for revenge, not exactly, but for the hand that would finish the calculation between them. There is a peculiar clarity and anticipation that makes each second voice its own small confession. And as Amos rose, slow, rheumatic with the small betrayals of time, he felt the grain of the chair under his palm and the ache in his shoulder like cold rope, the familiar companions of a man who had once believed that law was a straight rod and then found it twisted with compromise. He slipped his thumb along the leather of the holster, not in reach but in remembrance of the day it had been used, the day a trigger answered not only a threat but an old, fearful calculus aimed at preserving order at whatever small cost, and his hand trembled once, a syllable of weakness the world could witness if it looked closely, then steadied as if steadiness might be practiced into redemption. Memories came not as pictures but as weights, the sound of a horse's breath in the dark, the scent of cordite and wet earth, a boy's laugh turned into a gurgle that stopped too soon, women at a grave with hands clenched like prayer books. He had pressed his badge into the dirt and felt the soil take part of him with it, and he had carried on a duty that felt in truth like hiding behind a badge to stop his own heart from admitting what the law had not required. Downstairs the town tightened around the hinge of the saloon door, the way townsfolk do when a story becomes real in the moral accounting that used to be an academic exercise at kitchen tables turns up on the ledger and demands cash. Amos imagined the man in the doorway, Eli Ward, older, smaller in some ways because grief compresses a man, larger in others because survival makes a claim no one else can judge, and he knew the names the townspeople would be whispering and the faces that would tread through the memory of that morning 10 years past. He moved to the window and watched the man who had been thought dead lean against the wood like a verdict and felt, for a moment, an absence of the old defenses as if the town's collective memory had stripped him down to nakedness. His reflection in the glass, the badge like a heart, small moon on his chest, stared back at him and he thought, "You shot to protect a town but you lived with a body in your hands and that will not be undone by law or ceremony." The storm of consequence had finally found a voice, and Amos steadied himself because men who keep chambers full of unanswered things must either break or learn to answer them in a way that leaves a trace of mercy behind. The town of Dust Creek settled into that strange kind of silence that isn't quiet at all but full of breath held too long, like the desert itself was listening for the echo of a gunshot it already remembered. The street was a corridor of dust and dusk, each storefront glowing faintly with lamplight that wavered on glass like uncertain hope, and every window had turned into an eye, some afraid, some curious, some praying for the impossible, that history might skip this place, just once. Horses stamped and blew, their nostrils flaring as if they could smell the charge in the air, that sour mixture of sweat, iron, and storm. The wind came low from the east, curling around the saloon sign so it squeaked like an old hinge and rattled the church door down the road. The old preacher, Reverend Harlan, stood at the edge of his porch, fingers worrying a wooden cross he'd carved himself when his hands were steadier. He muttered the same prayer he'd said the night the town lost its innocence 10 years ago, when 2 men drew in front of the jailhouse and only one walked away. "Lord, if this is justice, let it be clean," he whispered, and the words seemed to vanish before they reached heaven. Across the street, Mr. Toll the undertaker was already at work without speaking a word, laying out a clean sheet, setting the lantern by the pine box, checking his instruments with the care of a man who's learned that death deserves dignity, no matter how it comes. He moved slow, deliberate, like this was a routine, and maybe it was. Dust Creek was a small town with a long memory, and its soil had taken too many men who mistook pride for purpose. The general store shuttered early, the clerk pulling down the blinds with shaking fingers, and the sound of the latch clicking echoed like a trigger cocked. 2 kids who'd been tossing marbles by the trop were yanked indoors by their mother, her face pale, her voice a sharp whisper, and sighed. Now, Doors closed one by one like a line of falling dominoes, until the street stood bare except for the preacher, the undertaker, and the dust itself. Overhead, the sky bruised purple, the kind of twilight that made the world look both alive and dying at once. The first star showed faintly through the haze, and in that thin light, the sign above the saloon. The copper spur swung lazily, creaking with each breath of wind. Everyone knew what was coming. Dust Creek had seen this before, men settling debts that couldn't be written down, words spoken that could never be taken back, and the awful patience of fate. From the window of the hotel, a woman watched with her hand pressed against her chest, her face lit by lamplight. She had lost her husband the last time a man came looking for the sheriff. Down the street, the blacksmith stopped hammering mid-strike, the ring of steel fading slow into the evening air, leaving behind an ache that settled in every ribcage. The saloon door creaked open once, and a man stepped out to empty a bucket of water into the dirt, his movements quick and nervous. He caught sight of the preacher and nodded, a small, wordless agreement that this night would end badly no matter who stood when the smoke cleared. Even the wind seemed to pause, listening for the moment the air would break. From far off, a coyote cried, thin and haunting, and the sound threaded through the street like a warning. Time and Dust Creek stretched long and elastic, bending around memory and dread. In one upstairs window, a boy no older than 12 pressed his face to the glass, his breath fogging the pane, watching for the moment when two shadows would meet beneath the saloon's eaves. His father whispered behind him, "Don't look," but the boy didn't move. Children always watched. They needed to see how men became ghosts. Downstairs, Eli's horse stamped once and turned its head toward the church bell, which hadn't rung since the funeral that split the town in two. And as the last light drained from the sky, Dust Creek became a painting in waiting, every brushstroke heavy with stillness. The town wasn't just holding its breath, it was holding its history, and somewhere deep in the dust, the earth whispered the same truth it always did before the first shot, that no one really wins when blood remembers. Eli sat at the corner of the saloon, back to the wall, his hat brim shadowing his eyes as the lamplight trembled across his face, and in that flickering half-glow the years folded inward until the present blurred into a reel of old dust and pain that played behind his eyes with cruel precision, each frame a gunshot of memory he couldn't silence. He could still taste the morning of it, the way dawn had broken over the ridge, soft and golden lying about peace, the air brittle and clean like a confession before the sin, and his brother Caleb laughing low, saying something about how the land smelled like rain. They were younger then, two men trying to make an honest claim in a world that didn't forgive mistakes, one with a conscience too big for his boots, the other with hands that shook when they held a weapon. And then came the sheriff, Amos Grady, not the monster Eli had made of him in the lonely miles after, but a man in a clean shirt with eyes already heavy from knowing right didn't always mean good. The fight hadn't been about hatred, it had been about law, about lines drawn in the dust that shifted with the wind. But that morning, law had worn fear's face, and when the gun went off it wasn't supposed to hit Caleb. It wasn't supposed to cut through him and drop him into the dirt like an offering to the sun. Eli remembered the way the sound shattered the dawn, how the world took a breath and didn't give it back, and how he fell to his knees beside his brother, pressing his palms to the wound as if sheer will could turn back time. But the blood kept coming, hot and slick, filling his fingers with the truth that mercy had come too late. Caleb's eyes found his once, clear, bewildered, still holding a smile that didn't know it was dying, and he whispered something Eli could never forget, "It ain't your fault," before the light left him. And behind the dying voice had been the sheriff, frozen, his revolver still smoking, the look on his face a scripture of regret that carved itself into Eli's mind so deep it became a map for every mile he rode since. He could still see the badge glinting in the new sun, mocking in its purity, and the tremor in Grady's hand as he took a step forward and then stopped, too cowardly or too human to come closer. It wasn't malice that pulled the trigger, it was hesitation, the fatal kind that kills innocence instead of evil, and somehow that made it worse. Eli had screamed, not a word but a sound, raw and unholy, the kind that breaks a man into two halves, one that buries the dead and one that follows the ghost. And for 10 long years, he'd followed, across plains and canyons, through towns that smelled of whiskey and gunpowder, always with that scar burning at the center of his chest, a pale reminder of the sheriff's other bullet, the one that found him after Caleb fell, the one that should have ended him but didn't. maybe out of bad luck, maybe divine punishment. He remembered the pain, how it seared through his ribs and then faded into numbness, how the world dimmed to the sound of hooves and shouts and his brother's name echoing through the canyon. When he woke, days later in the care of a stranger, the wound had closed but the fire stayed inside, a slow ember that flared every time he heard a gun cock or a preacher talk about forgiveness. And now, sitting in the saloon of Dust Creek, that ember was alive again, glowing under the skin, whispering the same thing it always had, that debts written in blood don't fade with time, they wait. His fingers brushed the spot on his chest, and he felt it pulse, a phantom heartbeat reminding him why he was here. He wasn't here to kill Amos Grady, not really. He was here to see if the sheriff's face still carried the same regret, if the man who had stolen his brother's breath had spent the years learning what it meant to lose your own soul. Outside, thunder rumbled low across the plains, and Eli smiled, small and tired, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes but knows exactly what's coming, because he had realized long ago that the wound never healed because it wasn't meant to. Some hurts are kept alive to make sure you never forget who you were when you were whole. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The saloon doors gave a long, aching groan as they swung inward, the kind of sound that makes men stop breathing, and even the wind seemed to pause outside, afraid to interrupt what was about to unfold. Dust floated in the amber light like slow-moving ghosts, and every glass, every card, every breath froze mid-motion as Sheriff Amos Grady stepped down the narrow staircase from the upper room, each bootfall heavy as judgment, echoing off the warped floorboards like the toll of a bell calling sinners to witness. His face was carved deep with time, every line a memory of choices he could never unmake, and though the silver of his badge caught the lamplight, it looked more like a scar than a symbol of law. He moved slowly, not from fear but from the weight of inevitability, like a man walking toward the ending he'd rehearsed in his mind 1,000 nights but never managed to rewrite. The air in the saloon changed with every step he took, thickening into something you could chew and choke on. And when he reached the last stair, the crowd split in two without needing a word, a slow current of bodies giving way as if death himself needed room to pass. Eli Ward stood at the far end of the bar, still as stone, his shadow long and sharp against the warped boards, hat brim low enough to hide his eyes but not the scar glinting on his chest beneath the open collar, an old wound that seemed to pulse with memory. For a long moment, the two men said nothing, the space between them humming with 10 years of silence, 10 years of swallowed rage and unspoken apologies. The only sounds were the faint squeak of the saloon sign outside and the steady creak of the fan above, turning slow like the hands of a clock counting down. Grady's hand rested near his holster, not in challenge but out of habit, while Eli's fingers drummed once against the bar, the rhythm of a heartbeat trying to decide if it should stop. Someone coughed, quick and guilty, and the sound snapped through the tension like a whip. Eli turned his head slightly, eyes finding the sheriff's, and when he finally spoke, his voice came low and rough, each word dragged from a well of years too deep to measure. "You owe me a bullet, Sheriff." The sentence cracked the silence clean in half, and somewhere in the back, a whiskey glass shattered, as if the world itself flinched. Grady's jaw tightened, the muscle in his cheek jumping once, and then he nodded, slow and sure, like a man who'd been waiting for his executioner to finally arrive. "I know," he said, though the words barely made it past his throat, and there was no Lefanson though, no law to stand behind, just the weary acknowledgement of a man who'd lived too long with ghosts. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved, and then the sheriff stepped forward, boots whispering against the floor, each step closing the distance between past and present, between guilt and reckoning. Eli straightened, his hand never drifting toward his gun, because this wasn't about who drew first, it was about who still had something left to lose. The bartender backed away, wiping his hands on a towel that trembled like a surrender flag, and the rest of the room became a wall of breathless faces, half of them praying for peace, the other half for spectacle. Grady stopped 3 paces short, his eyes locked on Eli's scar, and when he finally looked up, his gaze was softer than anyone expected, not with weakness, but with the tired mercy of a man who had been both executioner and condemned. "It wasn't supposed to be him," he said, and the sound carried through the room like a confession dropped into still water, rippling through every listener's chest. Eli didn't answer, just stared, the faint tremor in his jaw betraying the fire coiled behind his restraint. A storm flickered in his eyes, the same one that had carried him through a decade of lonely roads, and for a fleeting second, the world seemed to shrink until there was nothing left but the space between them. Two men, two truths, and one ghost neither could put to rest. Outside, thunder rolled low, far off but coming closer, and every man in that saloon knew they were about to see the kind of justice that no law could write down and no preacher could forgive. The saloon had gone so still that even the clock on the back wall seemed to hesitate between ticks, the air so heavy it felt like it might fall in on itself, crushing everything that dared to breathe within it. Sheriff Grady stood across from Eli Ward, shoulders bowed not from age but from the kind of weight that doesn't belong to the body. It belonged to the soul, and his soul had been carrying 10 years of silence that now begged to be spoken aloud. He opened his mouth once, no sound coming. Then again, the words scraping out slow and uneven, the voice of a man dragging his own coffin through confession. "I shot out of fear," he said, and though the words were soft, they carried through the room like thunder muffled by dirt. Not law, not justice, just fear. The admission landed heavy on the wooden floor, heavier than any bullet, and for a moment even the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. Eli didn't move. He stood the way he always had when life took something from him, silent, still, eyes fixed on the speaker like he was measuring truth against the memory that had burned itself into him all those years ago. Grady's hands trembled once before he gripped the edge of a table, steadying himself. The light from the hanging lamp swayed, painting the two men in amber and shadow, flickering as if unsure who it should illuminate. "I buried him," Grady continued, his voice thinner now, a thread unraveling. "Buried your brother with my own hands. Dug the hole myself out behind the church, just past the cottonwoods. Couldn't let the undertaker touch him. Didn't feel right. I prayed over him, though I had no right to. I said his name. Every sunrise since has felt like stealing from that grave." His words cracked then, not from weakness but from the weight of truth grinding against 10 years of guilt, and his hand went to his chest like the memory of that act lived there, a wound that never healed. Eli's face didn't change, no flicker of relief, no spark of fury, just that calm, unnerving stillness, the kind that carries more meaning than any outburst ever could. Behind him, someone shifted in their seat, the sound small but sharp enough to make everyone else flinch. The sheriff turned slightly toward the window, the last of the dying light bleeding through the cracks in the blinds, striping his face in lines that looked too much like prison bars. "I thought time might make it right," he said, almost to himself. "But time don't fix what conscience keeps digging up. Every man I've put behind bars since then, every outlaw I've gunned down, it all felt like chasing your brother's ghost, and failing." Eli's eyes lifted, and for the first time since he entered the saloon, there was something in them, not anger, not pity, but recognition, like a mirror tilted just right to reflect the cost of being human. He took a slow step forward, the boards creaking beneath his boot, and the sound was louder than any voice. "You think burying him made it right?" Eli asked, and the tone wasn't cruel. It was measured, quiet, shaped by years of waiting for this very answer. Grady met his gaze, his breath shallow, his eyes glossy with the kind of tears that never make it past the rim. "No," he said, barely audible. "But I couldn't let anyone else touch what I'd broken." The words hung between them like smoke from an old fire, thick, choking, but honest. The bartender looked down, the piano player stared at his hands, and even the preacher outside seemed to pause mid-prayer, as though sensing that something far holier was happening in that room than anything his sermons could name. The air felt heavy enough to crack, the kind of heaviness that comes not from death but from truth finally spoken aloud. And Eli, standing there with the ghost of his brother between them, knew this moment it wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about judgment, about seeing the man who killed his blood and realizing that punishment had already been served. Every morning the sheriff woke and remembered. He took another step forward, close enough to see the tremor in Grady's jaw, and said nothing, because some truths, once spoken, don't need answers, they only need to be survived. The wind came alive that night, crawling down from the high ridge like a wild animal hungry for reckoning, tearing through Dust Creek's narrow streets and shaking loose every loose board and memory it could find. Shutters clattered against walls, signs banged like warning bells, and the dirt that had slept quiet for months rose in angry spirals, a ghostly chorus swirling around the saloon where the town's fate waited to unfold. It was as if the desert itself, vast and ancient, had paused its breathing to listen, to bear witness to the final chapter of a story that had been whispered about too long and buried too shallow. The preacher, old Harlan, stood in the middle of the street, hat in hand and coat whipping around his legs, his prayer alone murmur nearly lost to the roaring wind, though perhaps that was fitting, for Dust Creek had always prayed too softly and sinned too loudly. His words weren't for salvation but for mercy, for something greater than blood to take root before dawn. Behind him, doors rattled and lamps flickered, each light in town trembling like it too feared what was coming. Even the horses in the stable stamped and neighed, their instincts catching the edge of chaos before it found voice. The storm was building fast, the horizon a bruise of dark blue and gold where lightning stitched jagged patterns across the sky, each flash catching the outline of a church steeple, the undertaker's porch, and finally, most haunting of all, the tall, rectangular windows of the Copper Spur Saloon, where two shadows faced each other in deadly stillness. From the outside, they looked like statues caught mid-breath, unmoving even as the wind clawed at the doors and the thunder rolled closer, a deep animal growl that spoke of endings. The townsfolk dared not step outside, but they watched through thin curtains, their faces pale ovals in the glass, watching the preacher's silhouette vow under the weight of his prayer. Inside the saloon, the silence was so complete it might have been carved out of stone, yet outside, nature screamed, rattling the very bones of Dust Creek. The storm wasn't just weather, it was memory made flesh, the sky itself remembering the gunfire, the betrayals, the cries that had gone unanswered 10 years ago. The preacher's voice rose once more, a broken hymn cast into the wind. Lord, if justice must come, let it come gentle, he pleaded. But even as he said it, the heavens door opened, and lightning split the ridge in two, illuminating the desert in blinding white. For an instant, the whole town was frozen in that light. The preacher, arms spread like a crucifix, the swinging sign of the saloon, the church cross trembling in its frame, and through the window of the Copper Spur, two figures stood locked in that divine flash, Eli Ward and Sheriff Amos Grady, the hunter and the haunted, the living and the almost dead, facing each other in a silence that screamed louder than any thunder. Their outlines flickered in the light like ghosts in a photograph, caught in an eternity between sin and forgiveness. The preacher lowered his arms as the wind drove rain against the dirt, drops hissing as they hit the hot ground. The storm was upon them now, hammering at the rooftops, filling the gutters, howling through alleys like a spirit long denied rest. And through it all, the saloon stood defiant, its lantern glow a single point of human stubbornness against the fury of the sky. Inside, Eli's hand hovered inches from his gun, not yet reaching, not yet surrendering, while Grady stood tall, his shadow trembling with the faintest sway. The lightning flared again, casting them in blinding brilliance, two men made small against the scale of judgment, and then plunged the world back into darkness. Dust Creek held its breath, as if the very earth were afraid to move, knowing that when the next flash came, something, whether man, memory, or mercy, would fall. The preacher bowed his head one last time, whispering words he no longer believed. Deliver us, Lord, from what we deserve. And as thunder rolled across the desert like a drumbeat for the dead, the first crack of gunfire broke the night's spine, swallowed almost instantly by the roaring storm. Eli rose slowly from his chair, the movement deliberate, soundless except for the faint scrape of leather against wood, and the saloon seemed to shrink around him as though the walls themselves knew what was coming and wished to hide from it. His hand brushed against the worn handle of his revolver, the one he'd carried across 10 years of deserts, canyons, and sleepless vengeance, the one that had learned his pulse so well it seemed alive. And when his fingers settled there, the entire room inhaled and forgot how to exhale. Sheriff Grady mirrored the motion almost unconsciously, his palm hovering above his own weapon, the gesture not so much a challenge as an acknowledgement. One final conversation between two men who had run out of words. Outside, the wind screamed through Dust Creek, rattling the shutters, shaking the saloon sign until it groaned. But inside, time had folded in on itself, and all that existed was this fragile, unbearable stillness between them. The piano player, eyes wide and sweating, rose from his stool without a sound. slipping toward the back door, his boots barely touching the floor. No one stopped him. No one looked, because every gaze was fixed on the space between Eli and the sheriff, that narrow stretch of dusty boards that had become the line between life and death. The clock on the wall ticked too loud, each click of its weary gears a hammer striking the seconds like nails into a coffin. Eli's breath came slow, measured. The weight of his years sat behind his eyes like lead, the memory of his brother's laughter, his dying breath, the sight of the sheriff's trembling hand that day. It all lived there, waiting for its final echo. Across from him, Grady's chest rose and fell like a man preparing to step into the noose. He'd spent 10 years living with this hour, 10 years waking before dawn to stare at the empty chair across from him, knowing someday it would no longer be empty. He had rehearsed 100 endings in his mind, one where Eli killed him quickly, one where he begged forgiveness and found none, and one, impossible and cruel, where Eli turned and walked away, leaving him to live with what he'd done. Now that the moment was here, none of those endings mattered. The sheriff's hand lowered an inch closer to his revolver. Eli's fingers tightened around his own. The saloon floor creaked beneath the tension, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the silence. A woman in the corner covered her mouth. A man dropped his glass, and the soft clink of its shattering was enough to make 3 people flinch. But Eli didn't move, not yet. He was waiting for something older than instinct, something that would tell him this was the right second to end a decade of pain. Grady's gaze held his, not defiant, not pleading, just open, as if to say, I deserve whatever comes. Then, like a crack splitting heaven itself, lightning flared through the window, white and merciless, casting the 2 men in stark relief, the sinner and the sinned against, though no one in Dust Creek could tell which was which anymore, and for that suspended breath of time, the world existed in that frozen image. Then came the motion. No one would ever agree who moved first. Some swore they saw Eli's arm twitch, others claimed Grady's gun cleared leather first, but all anyone remembered was the light, a single flare that seared itself into their retinas, followed by the sound, a gunshot so loud it didn't just fill the room, it tore through it, splitting Dust Creek into like the crack of Judgment Day. The echo rolled through the storm outside, bounced off the church steeple, and died in the hills, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt holy. For a long moment, no one moved, no one dared breathe, and then, as the smoke began to clear, the 2 figures remained, one standing, one falling, and the world exhaled at last, the storm outside roaring its approval or its mourning. No one could tell which. Inside, the saloon clock ticked on, steady, indifferent, measuring what was left of Dust Creek's soul. The smoke hung low and heavy in the saloon, curling around the lamplight like it had weight, like it wanted to stay and remember what had just happened. And for a long, breathless moment, no one moved. It was as if time itself had been shot through, splintered, and was now bleeding out across the warped floorboards. The thunderer outside had quieted, the storm slipping into that eerie stillness that comes right after the sky spends all its fury. And through the haze, 2 figures remained, one standing, one fallen. Eli Ward stood with his revolver still raised, arm trembling slightly, the gun smoking faintly in his grasp. Sheriff Amos Grady lay half sitting against the counter, his breath ragged, a thin line of blood trailing from his temple down to his collar. Between them, sunk deep into the wooden floorboards, was a single bullet hole, fresh, black-edged, the echo of it still humming in the bones of every person who dared to stay and watch. Eli's eyes followed the line of smoke rising from his barrel, slow and deliberate, before he let the revolver drop to his side, his hand shaking, not from recoil but from something far heavier, something that had lived inside him for 10 years and was finally beginning to claw its way out. The sheriff groaned softly, a sound that was more human than the man had allowed himself to be in years, and when he looked up, his eyes weren't filled with fear but with something worse, understanding. "You missed," he rasped, though his voice cracked like paper, and there was almost a ghost of a smile behind it, the kind that belongs to a man who can't quite believe he's still breathing. Eli took one step closer, boots dragging through glass and dirt, the floor creaking beneath his weight. "No," he said, voice low, unsteady, and for a moment, he looked down at the hole between them like it was a grave they'd both been digging from opposite sides of the same life. "That's your bullet, Sheriff." He looked at the revolver in his hand, the iron now colder than he'd ever known it to be. And then at Grady, whose badge had come loose from his chest and now glinted weakly in the lamplight like a fallen star. "You can keep it," Eli said, and his words were not spiteful, not a threat, just tired, raw, and heavy with everything he could never undo. He holstered his gun, the click of the metal sounding louder than the shot had, and turned away, shoulders slumped like a man who'd finally set down a burden too big for one life to carry. The crowd that had been pressed into the walls didn't speak, didn't breathe. They just watched as Eli walked toward the door, the rain beginning again outside, soft this time, almost merciful. Behind him, the sheriff tried to rise but couldn't. His strength was gone, not from the wound but from the years. His hand slipped through the blood pooling near his hip, mixing red with the spilled whiskey that had been knocked from the bar in the chaos. And when he looked down, the colors swirled together, amber and crimson, regret and consequence. His vision quirred, but not from pain. It was tears, hot and uninvited, streaming down through the dirt on his face, carving tracks through the grime of 10 years of penance. "Eli," he called out, weakly, but the name broke before it reached the air. Eli paused in the doorway, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, the silhouette of him framed against the silver flicker of lightning. He didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The wind rushed in from outside, carrying with it the scent of wet dust and something cleaner, something like release. Grady leaned his head back against the counter, eyes closing, a faint, almost grateful smile curling his lips. The bullet in the floor smoked faintly, the last breath of violence fading into the air. And for the first time in a decade, Dust Creek was quiet, not peaceful, but emptied, like a lung finally exhaling after holding its breath too long. Eli stepped into the rain, and the door swung shut behind him, cutting off the sound of the sheriff's soft sobs mixing with the steady patter of water, blood, and whiskey, all of it washing into the same river beneath the floorboards, carrying away what was left of sin, sorrow, and the man who had lived too long with both. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then. Let's get back on the trail. The storm broke over Dust Creek like a long-awaited judgment. Sheets of rain tumbling down with a kind of force that makes the world feel like it's being rewritten, washing through the gutters and alleys, turning the town's ever-present dust into dark, clinging mud that sucked at the boots of the few brave enough to step outside. The air that had been chokingly dry moments ago now smelled of wet sage, iron, and renewal, the sharp metallic pang of gunpowder giving way to something almost clean. The sky, once a black wall of anger, was now bleeding open in streaks of silver, lightning rolling farther away, softer, like the heavens themselves had decided enough blood had been spilled for one night. The saloon door creaked open, and the people of Dust Creek emerged one by one, not the bold, not the curious, but the weary, the ones who'd seen this town through drought and famine and men's pride, and they stood beneath their awnings, squinting through the rain at the lone figure walking down the street. Eli Ward moved slow, each step sinking into the mud, his hat trimmed low, his coat heavy with water, his shoulders hunched not from defeat but from the strange, unfamiliar lightness of a man who no longer carried hate like a saddlebag. Behind him, the saloon's lamps flickered against the storm's dying wind, and in that flicker, the faint shape of Sheriff Amos Grady could still be seen through the window, a motionless figure bent over himself, weeping into the silence he'd earned. No one followed Eli, not out of fear, but out of respect, or maybe awe. They had all been spectators to a reckoning, but what they'd seen was not vengeance. It was something far older, harder, and more honest. The preacher, Reverend Harlan, stepped out from the church porch, the rain plastering his thin white hair to his skull, his Bible clutched tight in one hand. He watched Hila go, the man's outline fading into the curtain of rain, and then he nodded once, a small, solemn gesture to the heavens. "Forgiveness wears many faces," he said softly, the words nearly carried off by the wind, but those close enough to hear felt them settle deep in their bones, heavy with truth. A woman nearby crossed herself. A miner took off his hat and held it against his chest, and the undertaker, Mr. Tall, who had spent the last hour waiting for work that would not come, quietly closed the lid on the coffin he'd prepared and pushed it back against the wall, as if admitting that not every story in Dust Creek ended in death. The rain fell harder, pelting the roofs and streets, erasing footprints, soaking away the blood that had splattered near the saloon steps, carrying it into the thirsty earth that had been waiting too long for something to grow again. A dog barked once and then went silent, the sound swallowed by the soft drumming of the downpour. The people began to move again, slow and unsure, like children waking from a bad dream, their voices low, their faces thoughtful. For the first time in years, there was no shouting, no fighting, no noise but the rain. Dust Creek had been a town built on since it refused to forget, but that night, under the cleansing storm, even the buildings seemed to stand a little straighter, as if they too could feel the weight lifting. The preacher tilted his face up to the rain and closed his eyes, letting it run down his cheeks like baptismal water. And when he opened them again, Eli was gone, just a shadow swallowed by the open plain beyond town. The horizon flashed once more, distant lightning marking the passage of something divine and final. The storm was dying now, easing into a soft drizzle that made the streets shimmer, and though no one said it aloud, they all knew Dust Creek had changed. It would still be a hard town, a lonely place on the edge of nowhere, but that night, the soil had taken its fill of sorrow, and in its place, maybe, just maybe, something like grace had begun to grow. Eli stood by his horse, the rain whispering against the brim of his hat and running down the dark fabric of his coat in silver streams that caught the faint light spilling from the saloon's doorway, where the lamp inside still flickered weakly, as if reluctant to die. The storm had calmed into a steady drizzle, the kind that cools the air and softens the edges of a place, and Dust Creek lay behind him like a photograph beginning to fade, its rough outlines blurred by the rain and the darkness swallowing the streets one lantern at a time. His horse, a weathered bay with a scar over its left flank, pawed at the wet earth impatiently, the leather saddle creaking as Eli swung himself up with the familiar motion of a man born to the trail, the sound of rain on hide echoing like applause for an ending no one had planned but everyone had known was coming. He sat for a moment, reins loose in his hand, the smell of wet dust and gun smoke clinging to the night air, his gaze drifting back toward the heart of town where the copper spurs sign swayed gently in the breeze, its chain squealing softly like an old memory trying to speak. Through the narrow window, the last glow of lamplight flickered against the storm's dying breath, and Eli thought, just for an instant, he saw a shadow move inside, a man's bowed head, still alive, still breathing, maybe finally at peace. The sight drew something out of him, a sigh that came from a part of his chest that had been locked shut for 10 long years. For the first time in as many winters, the knot behind his ribs began to loosen, the old fire dimming to something bearable, something human. He tipped his hat low and muttered to no one, "Guess we're done." Then, the words nearly lost to the rain, but the horse seemed to understand, shifting its weight as if ready to leave the past behind with him. The preacher's voice still echoed faintly from somewhere down the street, that line about forgiveness wearing many faces lingering in Eli's mind, not as comfort but as a truth he hadn't yet learned to refuse. He pulled the reins gently, and the horse turned toward the open plain, the road stretching ahead into a horizon smeared with the faint promise of dawn. Lightning flared one last time across the distance, sharp and white against the black sky, and for a heartbeat, the world around him was bathed in cold fire, the ridges, the church steeple, the muddy street, and then it was gone, leaving only the soft percussion of hooves in the wet earth and the rhythm of rain hitting his coat. He didn't know where he was headed, not exactly, maybe north to the high plains, maybe west where the land went on forever, maybe nowhere at all, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the road itself, empty and clean, the kind that doesn't demand anything but motion. As he rode, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of sage and the echo of a harmonica from some far-off ranch or dream, and Eli smiled, a small, tired thing, but real. He remembered Caleb then, his brother's laugh rolling through the years like distant thunder, and for once, the memory didn't cut like a knife. It warmed. The rain eased to a mist, and the clouds began to thin, breaking just enough for a shout of moonlight to slip through, silvering the edges of the plains. Behind him, Dust Creek was little more than a blur, its sins washed clean for now, its ghosts quiet. Eli didn't look back again. He nudged his horse into a trot, then a gallop, the rhythm quick and steady, the kind that matches a heartbeat finally free. Lightning chased him across the open land, not in anger but in farewell, throwing his shadow along across the soaked earth, and the sound of the storm faded into the distance, leaving only the wind, the whisper of rain, and the steady drum of hoofs carrying a man who had finally made peace with what he could not change. Sheriff Amos Grady lay in the narrow bed of his quarters above the jailhouse, the one that had felt more like a cell than a home for the better part of 10 years, his breath shallow but steady, his chest rising and falling with the fragile rhythm of a man who'd been given back something he'd already surrendered to the earth. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the world wrapped in a damp, heavy silence that carried the scent of wetwood, gunpowder, and absolution. The lamp beside his bed burned low, the flame flickering in the thin draft that crept through the cracked window pane, and its weak light cast trembling shadows over his face, lines carved deep from years of long guilt and sleepless nights. He could feel the ache where the bullet had grazed him, the sting beneath the bandage, the dull throb of his body reminding him he was still tethered to this world when by all accounts, he should have been taken. He had expected to die tonight, had walked down those stairs ready for it, maybe even craving it, but mercy had arrived instead of death, and that truth weighed heavier than the wound itself. His lips moved in a whisper, half prayer, half confession, a murmur to a God he hadn't spoken to since the day he'd buried Eli Ward's brother with trembling hands on a shovel slick with his own tears. "You should have taken me," he rasped, voice catching like rusted hinges, though even as he said it, he felt the faintest spark of gratitude flicker inside him, quiet and stubborn, like an ember refusing to die in ash. He turned his head slightly, wincing at the effort, and stared at the night through the small square window, the world outside washed clean, the mud glistening like dark glass under a pale sliver of moonlight. He could hear the sound of dripping water from the eaves, steady and slow, each drop marking time like a second chance being counted aloud. Somewhere in the distance, a horse's hoofbeats faded toward the open plains, and though he couldn't see him, he knew it was Eli, riding away from Dust Creek, carrying with him the last piece of a story that had finally ended. "You did right, son," Grady whispered into the darkness, though whether he meant it Eli, or Caleb, or some lost piece of himself, even he couldn't tell. His hand drifted to the badge pinned to his vest, a small, tarnished star that had once meant everything, once defined the shape of his days and the measure of his worth, and after a long pause, he unclipped it. The metal was cool against his palm, heavier than he remembered. He stared at it for a moment, turning it so it caught the lamp's light, and then he set it gently on the table beside him, beside his folded gun belt and the half-empty glass of whiskey that had gone untouched. The sound it made against the wood was soft but final. "No more," he said quietly, to no one but the night. He leaned back against the thin pillow, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling, each one like a vein of memory spreading out in all directions. He thought of all the faces that had passed through his life, the ones who jailed, the ones who'd buried, the ones who'd trusted him, and for the first time, their faces didn't accuse him. Maybe, he thought, this is what forgiveness feels like, not the grand salvation the preacher spoke of, but the quiet relief of not hating yourself quite as much when the dawn comes. His eyelids grew heavy, the rain's aftersong lulling him towards sleep, and he let it take him, drifting on the soft hum of the world reborn outside his window. The bench beside him caught the first hint of starlight peeping through the clouds, a faint shimmer in the dark, and though Amos Grady would wake again with his scars and sins intact, for this one night, he slept unburdened, his soul lighter than the air that had followed the storm. The sun sat high over Dust Creek, burning through the blue with that merciless brightness that bleaches the edges of things until even time feels thin, and the town, older, quieter, worn into the shape of its own survival, breathed slow under its heat. The years had changed it, softened the raw edges left behind by gunfire and ghosts, but not so much that the wind didn't still carry whispers of that night when thunder had matched the sound of reckoning. 10 years had passed, long enough for children to grow into men, for the scars on the saloon's floorboards to fade beneath fresh varnish, for memory to become story, but some stories have roots too deep to be forgotten. From the far road, a rider appeared, a boy, no more than 16, narrowed-shouldered and sunburned, his clothes stiff with travel and dust clinging to him like second skin. His horse was lean, its ribs faintly visible beneath its hide, the kind of animal that's known more miles than kindness, but it kept its pace steady as the boy rode toward the heart of town. He didn't speak when he passed the general store, did not when the blacksmith raised a hand in greeting, just kept riding, eyes forward, fixed on the hill that rose behind the church. Boot Hill, the place where dust creaked and watched the town in silence. The boy reached the foot of it and dismounted, his boots sinking into the brittle earth. He tied the reins loosely to a fence post, reached into his coat, and pulled out a folded envelope, worn soft at the edges, sealed not with wax but with something far stranger, something heavier. A bullet casing, polished smooth with age, pressed flat against the fold and tied there with tinfoil. He stood for a moment, staring at it in his hand, before looking up the slope where the grave sat beneath the sparse shade of 2 dying junipers. His steps were slow, respectful. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the faint creak of the church bell rope swaying in the distance. He found the grave easily. It wasn't the largest, nor the newest, but the one most carefully kept. The headstone was plain, the letters carved deep and even, Sheriff Amos Grady. He kept the peace. Someone still tended it, a jar of wildflowers, half wilted but fresh enough to speak of recent hands, sat at its base. The boy knelt, brushing the dirt from the stone, his fingers trembling not with fear but with the weight of something passed from one man to another across a decade of silence. He broke the twine, opened the envelope, and unfolded the letter within. The handwriting was unsteady, rough, the kind of script that belongs to someone who'd written more names in dirt than on paper. The ink was faded, the paper creased and softened by the oils of long travel, but the words, 6 of them, were clear as sunrise, debt paid. Right easy, old friend. The boy read it twice, then again, each time slower, as though the meaning might shift with the rhythm of his breath. He didn't know the full story, only the outline passed to him by a quiet man with gray in his beard and a faraway look in his eyes, the man who'd handed him the letter in the border town and said, "You take this to Dust Creek, to Boot Hill, to the man who earned it." That man hadn't given his name, but the boy had seen the scar through the collar of his shirt, pale and crooked, a reminder that bullets don't always finish what they start. Now, kneeling by the grave, he understood what the words meant, even if he couldn't explain them. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and rain that hadn't yet come, and the boy placed the letter atop the headstone, weighing it down with the old bullet casing so it wouldn't blow away. He stood, removed his hat, and bowed his head, not because he'd been told to, but because something in the quiet demanded reverence. As he turned to leave, he looked back once, and for a heartbeat, he could have sworn he saw 2 silhouettes in the shimmer of heat above the hill, a lawman and a cowboy, standing side by side, their faces turned toward the open plains, at peace. The boy blinked, and they were gone. He climbed back onto his horse, the reins loose in his hands, and rode out the same way he came, the wind trailing behind him like a sigh. Behind him, the letter fluttered slightly but stayed, and above it, the clouds began to gather, promising rain. They tell it in every saloon from the Colorado border to the dry bones of New Mexico. The story of the man who rode out of the grave and back into Dust Creek beneath a dying sun, a man whose name carried the weight of legend long before he ever meant it to. Eli Ward, the cowboy who came not for vengeance but for truth. Some say he was a ghost, that no mortal man could have survived the bullet that tore through him 10 years prior. Others swear they saw him ride in plain as day, flesh and blood, his eyes carved from grief and fire. Whatever he was, what he did that night changed the shape of the frontier in ways no gunfight ever could. The tale spreads like wildfire among travelers and drifters, passed between whiskey glasses and campfires. The words reshaping themselves each time they're told until truth and myth sit so close together you can pry them apart. They say the storm that night never really ended, that the rain which washed the streets of Dust Creek clean was no ordinary storm but something sent to rinse the land of its blood and sorrow. They speak of the sheriff too, Amos Grady, the lawman who bore his guilt like a cross until the man he wronged finally came to lift it from him. In some versions, they died together, 2 sides of the same sin. In others, they lived long enough to forgive one another beneath the crack of thunder and the hollow echo of a single missed shot. But the ending that stuck, the one most folks swear by, was that Grady lived just long enough to see peace, and Eli rode out into the rain, leaving the town to its silence and the truth to its own reckoning. The desert remembers in strange ways, and Dust Creek became the kind of place that carried its memory in the wind. Travelers passing through at dusk still hear it sometimes, when the world goes still and the sun bleeds its last light across the canyon's rim, a whisper threading through the sagebrush, soft and certain as prayer. You owe me a bullet, Sheriff. But those who've stayed long enough, who've learned to listen not with fear but with faith, say the sound isn't threat or curse. They say it's forgiveness, riding the wind like a hymn for lost men. The preacher, long since gray and bent with years, still keeps the church bell polished and silent, saying it's better that way. The sound of forgiveness don't need ringing, it just needs remembering. The saloon still stands, its floors worn smooth from the boots of those who come to see the bullet scar in the plank near the bar, the one left untouched through every rebuild, a relic of that night when sin and mercy drew and neither missed. Folks come from all over, leaving coins, flowers, sometimes just a name scratched into the wall, and each time the door opens, the light hits that scar just right, glowing gold like a reminder of something divine passing through mortal hands. Boot Hill sits quiet above the town, the grass growing a little thicker where Sheriff Grady lies beneath the junipers, and sometimes a letter or a trinket appears on his grave. No one knows who leaves them, though there's talk of an old man still riding the plains, his hat low, his eyes steady, keeping watch over the place that nearly broke him. As the years stretch thin and the world beyond the frontier grows noisier, Dusk Creek remains what it always was, a scar on the land that learned to heal. When the wind rises at sunset and carries the scent of rain, the old-timers pause and listen, and the young ones laugh nervously. But everyone, no matter their age, feels something move through the air, a peace earned, a promise kept, and a voice in the dust that reminds them all that redemption, once found, never really leaves. The horizon burns golden ash, and the legend of Dusk Creek rides on, unburied, eternal. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the ast and your heart pointed west.